Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're in round 3 of our coverage of the 2018 Tata Steel Tournament, and we have a good one today. One of the best chess games I've seen in a while. Excited to bring it to you today. White is played by fan favorite Vishy Anand, always bringing his A game to these big tournaments, and his opponent, number 2 player in the world, and that is Fabiano Caruana. We'll get started with Vishy. He starts out with pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight f3, and Fabiano does the same thing he did in round 1 against Magnus Carlsen, and he plays the Petrov, knight to f6. So this leads me to believe that Fabiano wasn't just playing games in round 1. This is the big preparation that he has for this tournament. He thought he would see a lot of pawn to e4, and so he's done a lot of preparation for the Petrov defense. We start out the same as we saw in round 1, and that is the knight taking here on e5. Pawn to d6, that is going to kick the knight back. Definitely a better move to play pawn to d6 than any other variation if you're going to play knight takes here on e4. Any of that, definitely better to just kick it back here, and then you can continue however you want to. Knight takes down on e4, and unlike Magnus Carlsen, who played queen to e2, Vishy decides to go with the main line, and that is to ignore this knight here for right now and play pawn to d4. Pawn to d5, adding support to the knight here on e4. Bishop up here to d3, getting ready to castle on the king side of the board, also attacking this knight in the center of the board. Kind of a pesky knight here on e4 that White's going to have to worry about for some time. Bishop down here to d6, also opening up for a kingside castle, and then castle on the king side. And many times what White's going to be looking to do is play pawn to c4 to disrupt this pawn here on d5, which is supporting the knight, and then play rook over here to e1, really trying to aim a lot of his material here on the knight on e4. Black castles on the king side, and then pawn to c4. Fabiano well prepared for this, pawn to c6. Both sides playing their moves in just a few seconds. You can tell both sides prepared for this opening, especially being the main line. They've seen it many, many times. And Fabiano, I can imagine he's seen all of these since this is his favorite opening so far of the tournament, only in round 3. So we see continue play queen to c2, just adding additional support, attacking the square here on e4. Seems like the entire game right now is centered around that knight on e4. Knight to a6, getting ready to come down to b4, threatening both the queen and the bishop. That is a critical square, so as you can imagine, White immediately plays pawn to a3 to stop that. Now all of a sudden you have the knight here on a6, not really doing too much. So you'll see that knight look to get to a better square. Right now it's just kind of hanging out, waiting to see what White does. The bishop's going to come down here to g4, just getting that bishop involved into the game. Black has now completed development. White does have a few things that he needs to do. He needs to get his dark square bishop involved into the game, but doesn't have too many great options right here. Normally he would be pinning down a knight with a bishop here to g5, but he does not have that luxury right now. Doesn't right now want to play knight to c3, and doesn't want to block his bishop off by playing knight to d2. So instead continues with knight up here to e5, and then bishop to f5. Since it's no longer attacking the bishop, decides let's go ahead and support this knight here on e4. And then we see pawn to b4, getting ready to push forward. Pawn to c5. Vishy also has the opportunity to just start exchanging in the center of the board, but if he wants to really push on his opponents, really make black have a cramped position, he could play this pawn to c5. So he has some options depending on how he wants to continue after pawn to b4. Now knight to c7, and this is the spot where Vishy Anand senses something, that this knight on e6 was kind of hanging out, didn't have to move right now, and Vishy Anand's putting a lot of pressure in the center of the board, and so he took a lot of time on this move. We see 27 minutes from Vishy Anand, where all the other moves he's playing in 5 to 10 seconds, very, very quickly, but he spent a lot of time to figure out how he wanted to continue in this spot, and he played pawn to f3. Says, yes, I'm going to weaken my king side by playing this, but I really want to attack and see what we can do with this e4 square. Fabiano continues with bishop to g6, and this does look a little odd if you're surveying the board here, because pawn just came up here to f3 to attack this knight. you would almost assume that this knight is going to move, but he doesn't. Bishop back here to g6. After only a few seconds, Fabiano does not take that knight here. He plays pawn up here to c5, continuing with his plan. If you're curious why, because Vishy and Anand didn't even take a lot of time in this pawn to f5 move. Both these players very familiar with the idea of if the pawn takes here on e4, then the bishop takes on e5. Pawn takes that bishop. We see the pawn take here on e4. You can see this opening up the door for the queen to attack here. Let's say the bishop takes, queen down here to d4, and this is a check, also attacking this rook here on a1. This would end up being extremely bad for white. So if we kind of look at this and say, yeah, this looks fairly easy, let's go ahead and take that material. You have to dig a little bit deeper. Both sides have been very prepared for this. So in this game, Vishy and Anand doesn't think too long about it and plays pawn to c5. Black decides, let's go ahead and take that knight here on e5. We see the pawn recapture. Then the knight comes up here to g5. And this is the first spot where Fabiano took time. Up until this point, you could tell that it was rapid fire. He wasn't thinking. Every move was 5 to 6 seconds. For this move right here, knight to g5, he spent 27 minutes, which is way beyond anything that he had taken close to in this game so far. He had a few options. He could have tried a pawn to a5. He could have said, yeah, let's go ahead and hang out here with this knight right here and play knight to e6. He had some options, but decided too much pressure on the center of the board. I'm going to go ahead and give up the control I had and play knight over here to g5. Vishy and Anand plays bishop to b2, so doing a good job of getting all of his pieces direct at his opponent. He has the bishop pair. It's an open board state. His queen and bishop have a pretty good combo here that if this bishop were to move, he can start to attack the king side even more. The only thing he really needs to do is get his knight involved into the game. Right now, it's not doing too much on board. Now black plays pawn to d4, which does disrupt a little bit for what Vishy was trying to do. It stops the knight coming here to c3, getting that involved into the game. But black's going to have to spend some energy, some pieces defending this square here on d4. He doesn't have any pawns that can easily do that. So Vishy and Anand has a couple options. He could play knight to d2, start to get that involved into the game. He has a few options after he comes to d2. Or he could play pawn to f4 and attack the knight here on g5. He's already moved up his pawn, so it doesn't really matter too much if he continues to extend it. He's weakened his king side just a little bit. He decides to go for the latter. He sees a strong attack here with pawn to f5. And Fabiano, sort of as he's done the rest of the game, he's looked at these attacks on his minor pieces and finds these small little windows where he says, I'm okay with you taking that material because I have a continuation that I'm prepared for and I want to continue with. So knight to d5. In this point, Vishy and Anand says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and take that. He didn't see a situation where it was going to end up biting him, where earlier he was going to lose that rook here on a1. Didn't see that. There is definitely going to be an exchange, but at the end of the day, Vishy and Anand was okay with it. It all starts with the knight coming down here to e3. This is attacking both the queen and the rook here on f1. We see white play queen to d2. Does not want to lose his queen, as you can imagine that. Bishop comes down here, takes here on d3. The queen takes. Now the knight's going to take on f1. And after the king takes, we see a nice little exchange from both sides. Vishy and Anand is comfortable playing with a rook and two minor pieces. And Fabiano on the other side of the board feels like he has a good pawn structure and he's okay with his three major pieces. Now the queen comes down here to g5. I'll take a minute and just see in Vishy and Anand's position how you would continue. He has a lot of options that he can go into play here. He could get his knight involved into the game. Hasn't played his knight anywhere yet. And all of a sudden, this queen is no longer defending this square here on d4. Has a couple options. Could take it with his bishop. Could take it with its queen. He could try to get some king safety because the queen can always come and check the king here. So what would you do if you were in white's position? Now, if you chose one of the options of take this pawn, probably not going to get the results that you would have hoped for. If the bishop takes here on a d4, then queen to f4 check. Bishop down here, f2 potentially. Rook to d8, attacking the queen. And then queen takes here on e5, attacking both the rook here on a1 and his pawn on h2. Probably want to stop the rook from falling, maybe knight to c3. And then queen down here to h2. If we come back and say, well, the bishop doesn't have to come to f2. Absolutely right. King could come up here to e2. Now rook to d8. Things get difficult for white because both the rook and the queen are both attacking the square right here, and the bishop can't move because then the queen would fall. So no great move that white has here, going to end up losing material. Now we come back and say, what if the queen takes? Okay, queen takes here on d4. Rook to d8 is the key move here. No great way for white to continue. Let's say queen to e4. Now rook down d1 check. King up here to f2. Queen up here to g6 is interesting. If there is a trade, maybe queen takes, pawn recaptures. This is a discovered attack. Now the rook is attacking the king. King up here to e3. Rook down f1. Going to be very, very difficult for white to hold on to this. If the queen does not take, if he decides to try something else, maybe knight to c3, let's hold on to that queen. I don't want to do the exchange. That was very, very bad. Okay, now rook up here to d2. King's going to move and the bishop is going to fall. That's not a good option as well. Queen doesn't have to come to e4. Let's say if he tries queen to c3. Rook down to d1, check. King up to f2. Another check from black. Rook to d8. It gets very, very difficult for white to hold on to this position. He's going to just have to start throwing pieces in front of it. At the end of the day, he is going to lose. So Vishy and Anand very wisely decided there's something up with the queen coming down here to g5. It's a very aggressive attack, and I don't just think you're going to give up this pawn here on d4 for nothing. So he decides to continue with knight to d2. Queen takes here on e5. And then Vishy plays knight to f3. Great central control from Vishy and Anand. He's going to be able to take this pawn here on d4. And this does threaten the queen, so it does need to move. Queen back here to h5. And then the queen can freely take here on d4. So white comes out with the exchange he was looking for. Still maintains control of the board. Black has three major pieces, but they're not really tied together with any sort of threat. The queen over here on h5 can't do much by himself. Kingside safety, but that only gets you so far. The two rooks really need to get in the center of the board, start attacking their opponents. Right now, Fabiano playing somewhat of a defensive game and just hoping that he can find a strong attack from his queen. Plays pawn to f6. This was a mating threat that he has to stop. Queen up here to g7. If you're wondering why he even played pawn to f6. Did want to stop the mate in one. Queen over here to c4. Check. King over to h8, getting in safety. Bishop down here to c1, preparing for the bishop to come up here to d6. This would be a great outpost now that he can see that the bishop here on b2 isn't doing as much, doesn't have the same threat that he had before, wants to find the best position for it. He's not going to be doing that by playing bishop to d4. What does that really do? Wants to get into a very, very attacking square here. d6 does that, cuts off a lot of the squares that black can go to, and there's no great way for black to really stop that. He doesn't have a minor piece, whether it be a bishop or a knight, and no pawn's going to be able to stop that. So that's going to be a critical square that black can't avoid that bishop coming to. So bishop down here to c1, rook to e8, bishop to f4 as we talked about. Pawn over here to a5, bishop to d6. So not going to get in way of Vishy's plan. It doesn't really matter what Fabiano is trying to do. The pawn takes and the queen recaptures. Going to be extremely bad if the pawn takes. Rook comes down here to a1. Check. Don't want to lose your rook for nothing. So decides to go ahead and take the queen with this queen here on b4. Doesn't have to worry too much about his pawn having protection because he does have this bishop here on d6 protecting it. Fabiano plays queen to d5. It's a nice little outpost in the center of the board. going to be a little tricky right now for white to kick that off right now. So it does control a lot, but will need to get some of his rooks involved into the game. Queen takes here on a b7, so doesn't even have to worry about this pawn coming to, let's say, b6 and try to disrupt this nice thing going that he has here on c5 and d6. Pawn to h6, opening up the door for his king to come to h7 if he ever needs to. King over here to g1, wants to make sure that his opponent can't get a cheap check in. So the queen down here to d3 would be problematic. But now really the only square would be queen to d4, which is defended by the knight here on f3. So wants to make sure that he has safety and then he can continue with any plan that he has. Rook down here to a4, so Fabiano recognizing what he needs to do, and that is be aggressive. Rook to a4, pawn to h3, a rook over here to c4, trying to get an attack going. Queen down here to b2, trying to hold down the fort. He sees he has a good thing going over here, so just trying to maneuver his queen to a very, very good position. We see queen come down here to d3. Rook to a2, just doubling up. He thinks he has pretty good protection with his king. Can always come up here to h2, g3 if he needs to. Queen down here to d1, king h2. Yeah, that's exactly what we were expecting to see. Rook down here to c1, starting the attack. You know, what are we really going to do from here? It's not exactly sure how you're going to continue. If you had another rook, okay, that's an option here. Or if you had something on, let's say, h4, that could be good as well. The knight would potentially have to take that. You could start to have some attacking going on, but you allow right now your opponent to just get his king involved into the center of the board, and you don't have enough pieces to really continue an attack. We see pawn to a4 from Vishy and Anand, and then pawn to f5. And f5 is an interesting move. I think he had some better options here. I think with pawn to f5 and then pushing forward to f4 because he wants to control this square here on a g3. So, you know, queen over here to h1. That's better. I think it's probably better if he tries the approach on the king side of the board. I do recognize the knight could take this here, but this does open up the door. The knight on h4 is much worse than on f3, where it is a very, very good square from here, but decides to go ahead and play pawn to f5. Now queen up here to b7, starting a potential attack on the king side of the board. f4, and then the bishop just takes. I think he gave up some free material right here. Rook takes here on a c5, so tries to blow up that outpost that white had going. Good thing, says I don't want to have to worry about that anymore. I'll go ahead and give up my f-pawn in exchange for a new pass pawn. Although very difficult for Fabiano to actually push this pawn, but he was able to get rid of that outpost. Now rook over here to d2, attacking the queen. Queen takes the material here on a4. And then we see Vishy play queen to f7. Very, very aggressive move from Vishy and Anand, really aligning his pieces up, starting to get a big attack, putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. Fabiano decides it is now time to play some defense, plays rook to g8, bishop e5, and now pinning this pawn down to the king. Not a lot of great options that black has over here. He's going to have to come out of this jam with his other queen and rook here. We see the queen come to c4, threatening the queen, and says, yeah, this is a bad piece. Let's just go and exchange on board. And then Vishy and Anand doing what Vishy and Anand does best is he finds an incredible move, a move that a lot of the players at the tournament tweeted about afterwards because it was so good. I'd say take a minute, pause the video, and see if you could find the best move that Vishy and Anand should play. Spoiler alert, he found it because he's the king. And Vishy and Anand played rook to d6. And after this, Fabiano resigned. There was no real way for him to continue. You can see what he's threatening. Rook to h6. And that is mate. Even if the queen takes here, yeah, take my queen, it's going to be mate. The pawn can't recapture because it's being pinned down by the bishop. If you were to try something else, let's say queen to h4. Okay, well, you can see how terrible that is. The knight's just going to take here on h4. If it says, well, let's try to protect that, but we don't want to have to worry about this knight. Queen down here to c1. Well, this has its own difficulties. We have rook up here to d8. This is preparing queen to g8. no great way to stop this. If we see the rook move, okay, well then just queen takes here on a g7. That's going to be mate as well. So many options that black has to worry about. Maybe instead, okay, let's take this rook on e5. Don't forget, the queen came over here c4 initially to attack this queen. The queen is still there. White can easily take that, still threatening a lot of options here. And so, okay, the rook's under fire. He's going to have to move. This is going to be a very easy endgame for Vishy Anand. At the end of the day, Vishy Anand walks away with the victory, playing against an opponent that seems to have the Petrov on his mind. He's been prepping for this, and Vishy Anand played phenomenally. I don't really see any moves that he could have done better at. There was a lot of traps that Fabiano tried to get him in. Every single time Vishy Anand found the correct way to continue. He had a specific game plan. He went through that, and at the end of the day, he found not easy move at all to win it and put the cherry on top. So congratulations to Vishy Anand. Love how he prepares for tournaments. Always seems like he comes in and crushes these when he wants to. So he is doing extremely well, tied at the top of the leaderboard. Fabiano does fall a little bit, knowing that didn't pick up any points today. But thank you guys so much for watching in round 3 of the Tata Steel Tournament. We've had some great games so far, and we have 9 rounds left. So thanks, everyone. I'll see you in the next video.